I'm Dana Goodnow, and this is a bird's eye view of Old Testament history. In this lesson, we're going to look at the book of 1 Samuel. It's within that collection of books that we can call the political books, those books that describe Israel as a nation, the politics behind it, the flow of events that take place from the time of the conquest in the land of Canaan right down through to the time of the exile to Babylon. And this book, 1 Samuel, is a bridge sort of book between a period in Israel's history that we call the Judges period, and we have seen some of those judges being individuals, particularly military leaders, but those who would bring justice to the nation when the nation had fallen away from God and God had brought judgment on them through surrounding nations. He would then, when they cried out for help, God would raise up a judge, a leader who would help stand in the gap, who would take on the enemy and defeat the enemy, and then establish justice, true justice in God's sight. And so that cycle we saw continued throughout the book of Judges, and the book of Ruth showed us a bright spot in the middle of that. When we come to 1 Samuel, we discover this is that bridge book. It takes us from the period of the Judges to the period of the monarchy when there is a king. The difference being that during the period of the Judges, it appears that God simply raised up from time to time and in different times a judge or a leader to address a specific need at that moment without a continuity of tribal background or of even a sequence of time. But when we come into the monarchy period, we find that because of the cry of the nation of Israel calling out to have a king, to be just like the other nations around them, that God established a monarchy that would have a continuous rule or reign of a family or a series of dynasties. And so there's this continuity of leadership within the monarchy period. And the bridge for that really is Samuel, because Samuel is the one who is considered to be really the last effective judge for God in that series of judges, and he's the one who inaugurates the monarchy period by anointing both the first and second king of Israel, that is Saul and David. So in the book of 1 Samuel, it's quite an important book for us as we understand the flow of Israel's history. By way of background to the book of 1 Samuel, the author itself, when we think of 1 Samuel, is certainly Samuel. He is one of the authors of this book, but of course the book goes beyond his lifetime, and so we would understand that there is a series of prophets who are writing this book under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit of God. And so we would find references to a number of prophets, not simply Samuel, but we would refer to the prophet Nathan. We could also look at the prophet Gad. These are names that are mentioned in 1 Chronicles 29:29, which tells us, as for the events of King David's reign, from beginning to end, they are written in the records of Samuel the seer, the records of Nathan the prophet, and the records of Gad the seer, a seer being a prophet. And what that shows to us is that there was a sequence or a series of prophets really throughout Israel's history that became responsible not only for proclaiming the truth of God and calling people back to that truth, but also who were the ones who were responsible for recording the scriptures for us. And so where one prophet would set down the pen, the next one would pick it up and carry on that history of Israel. We see this especially here in the books of 1 and 2 Samuel, the 1 and 2 Chronicles, the 1 and 2 Kings as well, seem to follow that pattern. So 1 Samuel, written by Samuel, Nathan, Gad, maybe others, but particularly these three who are mentioned. The date of writing then would be around 975 BC. This is a date which comes to about the end time of the recorded events in 1 Samuel. And the theme is the beginning of Israel's monarchy. If we were to try to identify a theme verse or a key verse for this particular book, we might find it in 1 Samuel chapter 8, verses 19 and 20, where it says, "The people refused to listen to Samuel. No, they said, we want a king over us. Then we will be like all the other nations, with a king to lead us and to go out before us and fight our battles." There are a couple of interesting phrases in that. We want a king. We want to be just like the other nations. Their distinct position under God, God being the king over them, wasn't satisfying to them anymore, and so they demanded to have a human king who could be visible, who could be present with them. They thought this kind of leadership would solve all of their problems. And of course, we know that it didn't. But this was what they called for, and this is what God gave to them. And so they move into a monarchy period. And so this key verse helps us to understand this flow of historical events in the history of Israel. As we think about this historical background, then we realize that the judges had periodically ruled and given direction to the nation of Israel, but then the people of Israel found that those continuous cycles of deliverance and then return to idolatry and then crying out to God, those cycles were wearing them out, and they felt that if they had a king that was consistent over time, that would help them. And so this is the direction that the book of 1 Samuel takes, and especially focusing on the first king, King Saul. So by way of outline to the book of 1 Samuel, we begin really with the rule of Samuel as judge. The first 7 chapters still are under that judges period. It's still Samuel who is the judge. And in fact, we find that the nation of Israel had once again fallen into a place of spiritual lethargy. The existing priesthood that would have been the ones who should have been upholding spirituality within the nation had faltered, and so the sons of the high priest were not godly people at all, and were scamming the people, and it was just an unpleasant situation. But when we open the book of 1 Samuel, we discover that there is a couple who is wanting to have a child, is childless, but Hannah, the mom, prays for a child, and God answers her prayer and gives her a son by the name of Samuel. A very remarkable and wonderful and sweet story of her prayer to God and God's provision for her. And so Samuel is born, and because Samuel is the answer to her prayers, she gives Samuel over to the Lord for his purposes. And so Samuel actually then is raised among the priests and the priestly class in Jerusalem. And there Samuel begins to grow into adulthood. And as he's growing, he is becoming more and more keenly sensitive to the voice of God. And so he actually, as a child, hears a voice in the night calling to him, and he thinks that it's maybe the high priest who's calling to him. And so he goes to Eli, the priest, and says, "Are you calling me?" And Eli says, "No." And then finally Eli says, "Next time you hear that voice, say, 'Speak, Lord, for your servant hears.'" And so Samuel, as a boy, when he heard that voice, said to God, "Speak, for your servant is listening." This is in chapter 3, verse 10. And God begins to speak to Samuel and begins to reveal to Samuel his plan. There's going to be judgment on the nation, judgment on the priesthood. And Samuel's reluctant, of course, to tell Eli these things, but pressed to do so, Eli gives him that bad news from God. We find in the subsequent chapters that exactly what God said did take place. Eli's sons, Hophni and Phinehas, go into battle against the enemies that are encroaching on them, and they take with them the Ark of the Covenant. They are thinking to themselves, having not had success in battle, if they simply had the Ark of the Covenant, then God would have to be with them. They're carrying God into battle, if you will. And we know that God doesn't work that way. We can't put God in a box. And so they attempt to win the battle by this approach, and instead they lose desperately. These two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, are killed. Eli, the high priest, when he hears that news, falls off from his chair and breaks his neck and dies. It's a scene of great despair and disappointment, and the Philistines become possessors of the Ark of the Covenant of God. And so this is the situation we find Samuel in. Of course, the ark is soon returned because the Philistines find that possessing the ark of God without godly background and influence is deadly to them, and so they send the ark back to the Israelites. But in this process, then Samuel begins to rise as the key leader of Israel, and he draws the nation back into a place of repentance. And in chapter 7 of 1 Samuel, we find that there's a continued battle with the Philistines, and actually in that chapter we find that Israel is given victory because God is with them. It says when Samuel was sacrificing the burnt offering, so Samuel makes a sacrifice to God to bring God into the picture in this fight against the Philistines. It says, as he was sacrificing this offering, the Philistines drew near to engage Israel in battle. But that day the Lord thundered with loud thunder against the Philistines and threw them into such a panic that they were routed before the Israelites. So the contrast was the priests who thought they could put God in a box and force him to fight their battles lost. But when Samuel simply brings offerings to God and acknowledges God as having sovereign right and rule over them, then God steps in and rescues them. So we find that Samuel is an effective leader, an effective spiritual leader, even in the military sense, helping to bring victory to the nation of Israel. But Samuel grows older, and as he's growing older and his sons begin to take on some leadership, their leadership is a poor level of leadership as well. And so the people begin then at that point to ask for a king. And so we found in chapter 8 how the people refused to listen to Samuel any longer, and they said, we want to be just like the other nations, and we want to have a king that will lead us. And so God says to Samuel that this is approved by God. He is going along with it. We know that this wasn't God's original intention. People were to live directly under God's rule, but without that direct rule of God, they would have a king instead. God knew this was going to happen. He talked about the monarchy back in the book of Moses, books that he wrote in the Pentateuch. So it doesn't surprise God, but it's a disappointing thing. It's like when we sometimes ask for those things that we know we don't really want or need, and God gives them to us anyway, not so much as a blessing because of our goodness to him, but because he just sometimes allows us to go the path we choose for ourselves so that we can learn the lessons of life. This seems to be what's happening for the Israelites. And so they enter into this monarchy period. Well, this demand for a king brings Samuel again to the forefront. He's the one to identify the first king. And so he sets out to find that first king. And that first king is a man named Saul. And Saul he's in many ways an enigma. He is chosen at first. He seems to be a humble individual. In chapter 9, verse 1, it says there was a Benjaminite, a man of standing, whose name was Kish, son of Abiel, and it says he had a son named Saul, an impressive young man without equal among the Israelites, a head taller than any of the others. So an individual that people could follow, that seemed to have abilities and physical strength and the things that would be necessary for a king in those days. And so through a sequence of events, Saul comes into contact with Samuel, and Samuel takes Saul aside and anoints him as the first king of Israel and instructs Saul to be ready to act when God says to act. And so Saul does indeed have an opportunity to act. When the Ammonites attack Israel, we find that Saul comes to the forefront. And it says, when Saul heard about this, the Spirit of God came upon him in power, and he burned with anger. And he raised an army, and he went and defeated the Ammonites. Well, Saul is off to a good start as a king. He raises the army, he defeats the enemy, and all seems to be going along well. But soon we find that Saul also falls into a sort of selfish pride where he takes matters into his own hand. In chapter 13, we find that he offers a rebellious kind of sacrifice where he is instructed to wait for Samuel to offer the sacrifice. Samuel within the priesthood is the one who is legitimately allowed to offer that sacrifice. But it says while they were waiting for Samuel to come, Saul got nervous about the long wait. And so it says he asked them to bring the offering to him, and Saul then made the sacrifice in Samuel's absence. He took on the priestly function, which was not fit for him. And so when Samuel arrives, he says, "What are you doing?" And Saul says, "Well, you were late, so I took it on myself to make this sacrifice, to make this offering." And Samuel says to him, "You have acted foolishly. You have not kept the command the Lord your God gave you. If you had, he would have established your kingdom over Israel for all time. But now your kingdom will not endure. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart and appointed him leader of his people because you have not kept the Lord's command." Now, this seems like a harsh sort of judgment, if you will, on Saul for seemingly one infraction along the way. We find shortly after this that in chapter 15, Saul again is involved in disobedience to God by not putting to death all the enemy, instead saving some of the sheep and the goats and the plunder that God had forbidden. And he claims that he had done that in order to honor God, although it was complete disobedience. And there in chapter 15, Samuel says, "Does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much as in obeying the voice of the Lord? To obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed is better than the fat of rams." In other words, always best to be obedient to God rather than trying to always make up for it through seeking his forgiveness for the sins that we've committed. It's some people have the attitude of, well, we'll just engage in sin. God will have to forgive us. Well, God wants us to be obedient, and this is where we find God's blessing, when we're obedient to him. Again, it seems as though these couple of incidents or infractions on Saul's part seem to be a little heavy in the sense that his kingship is taken away. But some have pointed out that these two incidents are probably, if you will, samples of what was taking place throughout Saul's reign over many years. That this was the kind of approach he was taking, that from time to time he would take matters into his own hand and disobey God and do his own thing. And so God knew that this was his heart. He did not have a heart that was following after God wholeheartedly, and so the monarchy was to be taken from him. And so in chapters 16 through 31, a significant portion of the book, we find that Saul's replacement comes on the scene. In chapter 16, we find the introduction of a young man named David. And David is chosen from among his brothers. He's the smallest, the youngest, the least likely, if you will, of those to be appointed. But Saul appoints David to be king. And it says in chapter 16, verse 12, that Samuel sent and had David brought in. David was ruddy with a fine appearance and handsome features. And the Lord said, "Rise and anoint him. He is the one." This is the one who is going to be the king of Israel, the man after God's own heart. We find in chapter 17, David begins to demonstrate his abilities by confronting a giant named Goliath, this Philistine giant that was intimidating the whole Israelite army, coming out in all of his strength, defying the army, defying the God of Israel. And David came to visit his brothers, and he saw this taking place, and he said, "I'll fight that giant. He may be strong and big, but I have God on my side." And we know the story, how he chose some stones from the river for his slingshot, the tool of trade for shepherds. And when he approached Goliath, he swung that sling around and threw the stone, and it hit Goliath and knocked him out. And David dispatched Goliath in that battle. It was because God was on his side, and he was willing to trust God in spite of the fact that he was much smaller, much less likely to be victorious. And yet he defeats the enemy. Well, people begin to rally to David, and not giving Saul all the credit that Saul desired. And so throughout the rest of 1 Samuel, we find this contest, if you will, between David and Saul. Saul trying to kill David on several occasions, trying to run him out of town. And in fact, David has to flee from Saul's presence or he'll be killed. And David is always careful never to lay a hand against God's anointed, against Saul. That was up to God to take care of. And David fled. He hid in hills. He hid in caves. He had hid in Philistine territory. He went wherever he needed to go to avoid Saul, avoid being killed by Saul, avoid having a confrontation with Saul. On a couple of occasions, we do read that David was very close to Saul, and even at one point was able to take a piece of garment from Saul or a piece of equipment from Saul, and then from a distance say, "Look, I could have killed you, but I didn't because I am a follower of God." And Saul would have a moment of remorse and go away, but then he'd come back again. And so we find Saul, as he continued in his disobedience, became more and more erratic, if you will, in his decisions and in the things that he was trying to accomplish. And so his leadership faltered as he approached the end. Well, at the end of the book, in chapter 31, we find that the Philistines are still at war with the Israelites after all of these years. And we find that Saul enters into battle with the Philistines. Saul is killed. His sons are killed. There's a great defeat of the Israelites because they have not followed after God. And so the first king in this monarchy dies a death in battle. Actually, it says that he was wounded in the battle, and he asked his armor bearer to kill him. But the armor bearer was reluctant to do that, so it says Saul took the sword and fell on it. And when his armor bearer saw that Saul was dead, he too fell on his sword and died with him. And so Israel lost its first king, a king who started with great promise but ended so poorly because of his own pride, his own decision to go his own way, his disobedience to God. God was looking for a man after his own heart, and that person would be David. We see a lot of David's movements in this book as far as trying to avoid Saul. In 2 Samuel, we'll see more of David's reign and how he accomplished a victory for the Israelites. What we find from this book of 1 Samuel, then, a number of lessons, but we could say that desiring the world's way leads to a world of trouble. It really does. If we want to go the world's way like the Israelites did, they wanted a king. And so that the desire to be like the rest of the world brought them into a place of trouble. And that happens in our lives too when we want to be just like the world. We find here that power misused leads to sin and judgment. Saul misused his power. Others did in the book as well. But when that happened, it led to judgment in the nation of Israel. But we also find that trusting God often involves waiting, patience, and hardships. David waited patiently. He fled from Saul, refused to harm God's anointed one, and God would reward him for that. But it was many years that David was waiting for his chance to step into the role of king, and he waited for God to bring that about for him. We need to be patient and wait for God to bring about his purposes in our life. And of course, the story of David and Goliath is a great reminder to us that when we trust God, he can do great things through us. So the book of 1 Samuel, this bridge between the judges and the monarchy, has so many good lessons for us, a reminder that when we follow God's ways, his ways are always best.